97,000 teenage births in 2017. Teenage pregnancy is on the rise. Clearly, we are failing when it comes to educating our children, whether it's at school or at home. And it gets worse. New HIV infections are also going up. LGBTIQ pupils are facing discrimination, stigma, and bullying at school. So are we having the right conversations around sex and sexuality at school? What should the sex education curriculum entail? Joining me now is Nalane for Reproductive Justice Founder Dr. Tlaleng, Mofokeng, and educational psychologist Claudia, Abelheim. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. You two had a lot to say to each other when you were waiting. What do you make of this, the curriculum at the moment? I mean, is it sufficient? Is it doing a good job?
So the simple answer is no, it's not sufficient, and no, it's not doing a good job. And I think the Department of Basic Education has been stuck in policy mode for a long time. Review upon review of policies that are not implementing. Exactly. And I think there's a lot of sort of system failures, but I think a lot of gatekeeping around schools and what gets taught in schools in terms of schools governing bodies and, you know, the amount of power they have to either say yes or no to certain things. And of course, we find that comprehensive sexuality education is that one subject in life orientation that often takes a lot of the, heat, I suppose, from parents. But also, I think, we don't do enough of really training the teachers to be able to implement or at least deliver content in a way that's affirming, in a way that's positive, because they themselves were children who never grew up with access to comprehensive sexuality education.
So how do you train them then? I mean, what should be happening?
So I think language is a big thing, right? So even if you don't receive formal training or at least scripted learning as a teacher, there are certain prejudices that we all hold, and you need to be aware of those and challenge those on your own. There's a lot of online content that's out there. For example, the UNESCO guidelines and the technical, documents that came there. That's what we should be adopting, all of us. It's there. But I think the honor still, falls on the government of basic education and higher learning, of course, to ensure that they are incorporating good training in undergraduate level of teachers and anyone who will come into contact with children, but also for their own good. Because if you own your own prejudices, your own discrimination, again, members of the LGBTIQ community, if you have children who are still fluid and questioning and not really in a box, non-binary, children. And again, the issue of saying, things have to be age appropriate. Often age appropriate is used to actually keep information away, because people will say, well, this child is still small and they're not good enough, as opposed to evolving capacity.
Okay, you touched on many points there. I mean, how do you see this playing out? The lack of adequate conversations around sex, both at school and at the home.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the numbers earlier, and I think they speak for themselves. And obviously what's been gone on this week after the article that was published on Sunday and the backlash that's come out of it, we just
that
really...
was talking about, well, there was an allegation that there'd be discussions about masturbation.
Referring to the new curriculum that the Department of Basic Education is trying to implement, and it said that this masturbation is going to be taught to grade 4 pupils. And I think that the outcry that's come from that article is very terrifying. I mean, it's really scared my department. This is what we do. We run sex ed for schools.
So if it scared you, is it because you believe it should be tackled at that age? I mean, people should know about it.
And I mean, and content around, sexual health, right? It's around cognitive skills, it's around emotional skills, social skills, and of course, physical skills around sexuality. But what often is missing from what people need to, have a view of not wanting to give children content is that no one is teaching children how to have sex, but we are discussing issues of consent. We are discussing issues of boundaries. We are discussing issues of how do you negotiate safe spaces around your own body firstly, and how do you respect other people's spaces. And of course, it does take into account the cognitive, stage that the children are in. However, children are often questioning. So by the time an 8-year-old asks you a question, you can't say, well, you're too young for it. They're already asking you because they've been exposed to that information somehow. And so as parents, as caregivers, often unprepared for the questions, we then get defensive, we avoid the topic with children, and then again, we outsource that responsibility to school teachers.
And I guess you're going to be sort of picking up the mess. I mean, how does this play out other than falling pregnant early? I mean, what are the signs that you should look for other than pregnancy? I mean, how does it play out, and what sort of impact does it have on the child, sort of psychologically, if they feel they've been left behind?
If they feel they've been left behind in terms of sexuality education?
Yes.
Well, I think that they go and they find the information for themselves. And I think that what we need to understand is that children, you know, they live in a world that is so different to the world we lived in.
Yeah, we can't actually
We
impose
can't. The information is available to them immediately, and vast information. And unfortunately, not always correct information. So, you know, whether we like it or not, these kids are going to go out and find out what they're yearning to know. And the scary part and the risky part is that if we're not teaching them where they're finding it, and how do we know that they're finding the right information?
Because curriculum, you know, it wasn't a thumbsuck that these curriculums and these guidelines are developed.
Yes, There's research. How do you test it? I mean, what is the research behind it?
I mean, there is research currently. I mean, if people want to talk about a South Africa context, right, that's coming out of the university currently known as Rhodes, from the psychology department there. And Professor McLeod is leading with some groundbreaking research around, you know, Buffalo City and Eastern Cape, around what is being taught in life orientation, but what do young people themselves want to know? It's like driving a car. We all understand that we live in a country that you need a license to drive. But when you are 17 or 18 learning to drive, a parent doesn't do that because they want you to be in a car accident, or they're saying you can afford to buy a car. They're saying when you do get to drive a car, you need to be a safe driver, you need to know the rules of the road, and you need to be, you know, taking care of responsibility of your own driving, but then also be aware of other drivers on the road. And that's exactly the principle of sexual comprehensive education.
You also raise a good point. I mean, it's getting it right at school and then being able to take it home, and the parent can also discuss it with you.
So important. It can't be left up to the school. For me, it's very important that it happens in the school, but it's so equal, and I think that the parents, it's vital that they're involved. They have to be.
Because when should it start, and how do you pace?
It should start at birth.
ASAP, as soon as they...
In fact, we don't even have a choice. I mean, a lot of the times when you are pregnant and you say you're pregnant with a girl, people are already asking you where you're going to try for a boy again. Now, that's already a gendered issue of discrimination. You know, why are girl children not valued as boy children, for example? So it's not just even an issue of will young people have sex early. It's a whole societal mindset. The fact that, you know, consent for just touching you, hugging you, giving you, you know, a kiss is a real thing. So if we exceptionalize abnormal sexual behavior like rape, and if that's the first instance that young people are learning of consent in schools, which currently they are, it's doing it the wrong way around. We need to be teaching children healthy, normal relationships. They need to know what's healthy and normal in terms of sexual health, and move away from the fear-based curriculum and messaging around sexuality.
And I think it's also really important to just point out that, you know, we use this very broad term, comprehensive sexual education, and I think a lot of people who don't know about it kind of immediately go to that masturbation in grade 4 and pornography and all the really like hectic sides of sex ed. But it's much more than that. It starts with naming your children's genitals with the correct name when they are 3.
And that's really important, isn't it, when it comes to sexual assault cases? Isn't it? Because
it's
often turned against them when they don't understand.
Absolutely.
Exactly, and describing things in terms of flowers and fruit and, and all of those things.
That's where it begins. That's part of sex ed. Are we talking about masturbation to a 3-year-old? No. But do we start having that conversation when they are 3 years old? Yes, because that's where it begins. Body awareness, body pride, body dignity. You have to lay those foundations before you can start talking about consent.
And then how do you get a parity amongst the schools? Because there's such disparities, isn't there?
And I mean, a lot of the private schools, you know, that I support, especially their trainers, is that they are ahead of us in certain ways. And I think the biggest fight for me is that a lot of the people who cannot outsource this, a lot of communities who cannot outsource this service to psychologists or private practitioners still depend on the Department of Education to do their job. And where they fail, their failures, unfortunately, are catastrophic. And it's never too late to start, though. And I really do believe that in South Africa, in terms of the levels of gender-based violence, in terms of the level of sexual violence, every single person in South Africa needs to somehow find an entry point where they can access this information, because none of us were recipient of affirming rights-based type of sexuality education. So we all need to relearn consent. We all need to relearn boundaries, but we have to demand inclusivity in terms of LGBTIQ plus children, but also link people to services. This is all well and good, but if you still have the Department of Health who says, well, we can't go into schools because, you know, we're not running child birthing units in schools. You have schools who are saying, well, you can't come in here here because we're busy with learning, and pregnant teenagers must leave.
There's got to just be education.
It has to be integrated, but it has to be a rights-based thing, because even if the young women are pregnant, they still have rights to access, education and dignified care. So we cannot play this game of saying, well, we'll punish you because you are pregnant and in school, when we know the numbers of rape and
again,
violence.
that's important, isn't it? You don't want who's ever delivering the information to be loaded with, outdated ideas or something that's possibly happened to them.
Exactly, or their own personal stuff. I mean, like we were saying earlier, it is a sensitive area, and it can really push buttons. So part of the training has to be making sure that people have sorted out their own stuff around this subject.
Okay, well, let's leave it there, ladies. Claudia, Abelheim, and Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng, thank you very much. So the message really is to get started early with your children. Talk about sex in a good way, obviously.